Hi everybody and welcome back to MENSCHlife. I'm David Grossman. And
I'm Doris Epstein.
And we're delighted to be here with our guests. We have with us today Channa Sargon, who's a Bible teacher here in Toronto, and also Salomon Benzimra, who is one of the founding members of Canadians for Israel's Legal Rights. Now today, of all days, Prime Minister Netanyahu is going to be meeting with President Obama. They've been trying to get together for a meeting for a while. The last time they met, Netanyahu basically sat in the hallway and Obama gave him a list of demands and then said, I'm going to have dinner with my family, so let us know if you have any news.
Not nice.
Not nice at all. And the relationship, as we know, between U.S. and Israel has been deteriorating. And Obama, I think, to some extent, is setting an example for many people, both citizens of Canada in the U.S. and perhaps other countries around the world. So one of the things that one of the rhetoric that we hear from Obama and Hillary Clinton and others is they talk about settlements in the West Bank and construction and the fact that it's illegitimate or illegal. So that is one of the things, one of the key things that we want to talk about today with our experts. We want to understand what is the Jewish connection, what is the Jewish right to have Israel and certain borders by law, by history, and by religion. So that's the topic of today's show. We hope you'll be with us.
And pay attention, because this is not generally well known, and even in Israel, right, Salomon?
That's right.
The Israel Museum that tells the history jumps from the Balfour Declaration to 1948. With nothing before or in between.
So there's some very important things that happened in between that period,
Crucial.
Starting with the Balfour Declaration, leaning forward.
And it is not general knowledge.
Which we're going to talk about. And that's what we're going to lead off with right after this break. Hang in, we'll be right back. Okay, so we are back here on MENSCHlife. As I mentioned, our very special guest, Channa Sargon, who's our Bible teacher. She understands things from a religious perspective and historical perspective in terms of the Bible and the Torah. And, of course, Salomon Benzimra, one of the founding members of Canadians for Israel's Legal Rights. And just before the break, Doris alluded to some history with the Balfour Declaration and what happened, but that many people don't know about. Many people think that Israel started in 1948.
That's right.
But that's not the truth. Salomon, tell us a little bit about the background.
Yeah, this is a misconception that you find everywhere, even from reputable writers and pundits like Thomas Friedman. Some years ago, he wrote a book called From Beirut to Jerusalem. And in the first page, he draws the chronology of the events, and it jumps directly from 1917 to 1948, as if there were nothing in between. So that period of history is very much unknown, and it is fundamental to understanding the legal rights of Israel.
Okay, so what happened during, I mean, we start off with the British Mandate, which says what?
Well, the British, we start up with the Balfour Declaration, which was just an expression of British foreign policy, without any international law validity. After the Balfour Declaration was issued,
which was 1917.
In 1917, the World War I was still on. During World War I, people were, all these main governments, the Allied powers, were trying to get zones of influence. And at the end of World War I, the Ottoman Empire was dismembered. They sat at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, and then to solve the problems of Europe, they stayed in Paris with the solution of Hungary and Austria and Germany and so on. But for the Middle East, they said, we are going to decide that in San Remo. And they went to Italy in San Remo, and the Supreme Council of the Allied powers,
which were who?
Which were France, England, Italy and Japan, with the United States acting as an observer, because the United States never joined the League of Nations. And in Sanremo they decided we are going to put, first of all, the Balfour Declaration as an act of international law. That means that we're going to elevate it from the level of expression of British internal foreign policy to an act of international law. And second, we are going to have Palestine designated as a mandate in which Britain will be the mandatory power, but the beneficiary will be the Jewish people.
Okay.
The Jewish people, how did they define the Jewish people? The Jewish people then living in what was called Palestine? The Jewish people all over the world?
Yeah, it was the Jewish people all over the world. There were a minority of Jews living in Palestine at that time on a continuous basis since the end of the Second Temple period. But they recognized this fundamental question of the historical connection of the Jewish people as a whole to the land of Palestine. And on this historical connection, this is the foundation on which everything is built.
Which Channa will talk about later and spell out exactly what the historical connection was. Yes.
Okay, so moving forward, so the League of Nations basically says they enacted this where,
Well,
so there'd be a period of time until the Jewish people, like the British would sort of govern, or they would act as the trustees
That's right.
until
That means
the
that,
Jews could take over.
The League of Nations were not directly involved in Sanremo. It was the Supreme Council of the Allied Powers. They made a decision in Sanremo which was a judicial decision. These people, these four countries, they had judicial power to adjudicate territories because they were the victors of the war, and they decided at that time that they are not going to colonize these territories as it was done before, that they would follow the Wilsonian principles that were put out by President Wilson in his 14 points, which is basically no secret treaties between countries. Second, we are going to allow for self-determination of people. That means that the voice of the people should count at least as much as the voice of the states. And third, we are going to have an assembly of nations in order to avoid war, so that people can discuss matters rather than coming to arms immediately.
Okay, so then fast forward to 1948, the Jewish people at that point had an opportunity, or at that point the UN proposed the partition plan, correct?
Which was illegal, David.
Yeah. Well,
Which must have been illegal according to international law at that time. Everything west of the Jordan to the Mediterranean was the land of the Jewish people.
Well, but because many things happened between Sanremo was in 1920, at the end of World War I. So they decided that Palestine should be under a British mandate. Then the mandate was drafted, and eventually it was accepted by all the 51 countries of the League of Nations in 1922-23. And from that point on, Britain was just like the administrator, the trustee. It didn't have any decisional power as a sovereign. It was not a sovereign. It was a trustee which was acting on behalf of the Jewish people until the point where the Jewish people would be in sufficient numbers in Palestine and they would be able to declare sovereignty.
Right. Okay.
And during those 28 years, between 1920 and 1948, the British did everything they could to violate these rights of the Jewish people.
Such as what?
It started in 1921 with the first truncation of the eastern part of the Jordan River, and they gave this territory to Emir Abdullah for whatever other reasons of European politics between the French and the British. But the fact of the matter is that part of the territory formerly assigned to Palestine was truncated in 1921, in 1922 with the Churchill White Paper. And from these white papers, there were three white papers: Churchill White Paper, Passfield White Paper, MacDonald White Paper was terrible. In 1939, just a few months before World War II, they decided we are going to curtail immigration, Jewish immigration to Palestine, because it offends the Arabs, and we want to keep in good relations with the Arabs because we don't want to shift them into the side of the Germans. And they basically, in the MacDonald White Paper, the British abdicated all their obligations with the mandate, because they said there should not be a Jewish state here. The Jews should only be 1/3 of the population, and they would be only a single state instead
so
of
they
a
were
Jewish state.
they were reneging on their earlier
Absolutely.
commitments. Okay, we're going to take a short break, and then we're going to come back and we're going to ask Channa to give us a bit of a religious and perspective from the Bible in terms of what's the Jewish connection to the land. So hang in there. We'll be right back. Okay, we're back here on MENSCHlife with our special guests, Channa Sargon, Bible teacher, and Salomon Benzimra, founding member of Canadians for Israel Legal Rights. And we've been talking about some of the history in the early 1900s with the Balfour Declaration leading up to the San Remo
Treaty.
and that
mandate.
basis for the Jewish connection to the land and Jewish rights to the land. But let us understand, Channa, help us to understand from a Bible perspective, from the Torah, what is the Jewish connection to the state of Israel? What's God's promise to the Jewish people?
I need to start from the very, very beginning. In the book of Genesis, chapter 12, we meet the first Jew, it's Abraham. And the first commandment that he gets is to go, lech lecha, to leave his home, and to go to the land. And the Jewish birth of our people and our values begin with a definite connection that has to do between the physical and the spiritual. The Jewish nation, the Jewish people cannot survive without the physical expression. Most nations are born and don't have to journey. The Jewish people have to journey in order to come to a harmony where the spiritual part of their expression and the physical are together. Therefore, when you look at the biblical narrative, you get a very clear message that it cannot be separated. Anybody who would try to separate the Jew from Israel doesn't understand that it doesn't exist. We are connected to a land, we are connected to a people, we are connected to values, and the greatest picture is, of course, is the destiny and the role of the Jewish people, which is to hopefully...
When was that spelled out? And when did we become a nation?
We became a nation right at the beginning of the journey, with the birth of the first
Abraham?
Jew with Abraham. Anybody who opens up the narrative sees the birth of the first Jew, that God says to him, Lech lecha me'artzecha, you leave your old homeland and you go to a new land. So for today's reality...
Meaning Israel.
Israel. For today's reality, anybody who would try to make this separation is not only is not able to do it, but he is not getting the essence of our people.
Okay, do we have an idea of what the borders are based on
The
those
borders
original
are
promise?
from the two rivers, from the river of Egypt to the Iraq, the full land of Israel. The borders are very clear in the biblical narrative. However, what I want to talk to today is more about the covenant.
Okay.
And the covenant spells out, we have a covenant with God, and it's called in Hebrew, Brit Ben Abitarim. And there God says, this land is going to be your land, Achuzat Olam, Ad Olam, forever and ever and ever. This covenant spells out the role that we have among the nations, our purpose, our destiny, and it's always, always connected to the land of Israel. Now what we have through history and the biblical narrative and our history is that we get expelled from the land, but we always come back. As a matter of fact, I just want to highlight you. I met somebody in Israel who heads one of my charities, and he comes from a family that never left the land of Israel, from Shfar'am and Pki'in, which are two villages the Jews have always lived. They were never part of the expulsion from Israel. So in other word, the biblical narrative has a clear, consistent message. The people and the land are one.
Do we know how it is that some people in either Christianity or Islam have, since those religions are founded on Judaism, how did that original message get lost or twisted, that so many people are trying to take Israel away from the Jewish people now?
I want to. This is Samuel expertise.
No.
He's better than me. I just want to make one point that's very clear. The Christianity and Muslim in the biblical narrative, I can only talk about what I know, and that's the Bible, because I'm a Bible teacher. They're not connected to a land. Christian can live anywhere in the world. He can be an Italian Christian. He can
And
be
Muslims?
a Greek. And Muslims they have their Mecca, but it's not connected to Israel. What is really clear, what is really spelled out, is that we are people that have a spiritual connection to a land. We cannot become what we need to become, and hopefully, and we pray to be the light upon the nations. We will not be able to do that without the connection to the land.
Okay.
So, from the spiritual aspect, you can't make the separation. It's very different.
Okay,
than
so
Muslim
it's
and
very
Christianity.
fundamental to Judaism. We're going to find out. After this break, we're going to take a short break, and then we're going to ask Salomon, why is it that so many people want to take Israel away from the Jewish people, especially when the foundations of Christianity and Islam are based on the
I
Bible?
think
Hang
we-
on, hold
okay.
that thought. We'll be back in just a second here on MENSCHlife. Okay, we are back here on MENSCHlife with our special guests, Channa Sargon and Salomon Benzimra. So the question was, again, if the foundations of all of the world's, well, all of the Christianity and Islam is based on Judaism, we know that Judaism ties the Jewish people to the land of Israel in such a basic way. Why do we have so many people, including Jews, who want to
right.
tear Israel away from the Jewish people?
Well, this is the fundamental question that comes up regularly in the media. Even is that people don't generally make the difference between what is a people, what is a nation, and what is a state. Even recently, in the National Post, there was a controversy about that the issue that Israel was created in 1948. When you see that, it means that the state was created, but the nation is far more important.
Right.
The nation of Israel is a nation arises when a people is connected to a land. There are all kinds of people who are not connected to lands. They are not nations. They are peoples. Eventually, they would aspire to be a nation, but they are not yet. So, in the case of Israel, biblically, as Ruth was saying,
Channa, yes.
Hannah was
Right.
saying, the nation started in biblical times in the days of Abraham. And it kept on going like that until the destruction of the Second Temple, with some ups and downs with the Babylonian exile and other periods like that. But eventually there was a big black hole after the year 70 of the Christian era to the year 1920. For 1850 years, there was no connection, recognized connection between the land and the people.
When you say recognized, you mean
Recognized by
international.
internationally.
Okay.
Because the nation disappeared in the year 70 when the temple was burned by the Romans, maybe a few years later with the Bar Kokhba revolt. But all that period from antiquity to 1800 to 1920, there was no official recognition of the linkage between the people and the land, which means the nation. And that happened in San Remo. In San Remo, the international community decided that land should be the homeland of the Jewish people.
Okay.
And they established this connection between land and people, and that is why I consider that San Remo is the reconstitution of the nation. The nation of Israel came up, and only 28 years later, the state was created.
Can I add one thing? It's very interesting to what you're saying. You're looking at it from the legal perspective. Now, I'm going to go to the other place, and that is not only the spiritual, the cultural, and the connection. My understanding of the narrative is it doesn't matter where a Jew was, he was always part of a nation and connected to a land. All the literature, all the writings, all the Talmud Bavli, and everything that was created in the diaspora was always connected to Israel, to the nation. So the nation of Israel could only survive if Israel is with them all the time. We have a very old sage, Baal Shem Tov, who said, every place I go to Israel. לכל מקום שאני הולך,
But
אני הולך
it's a spiritual...
It's a spiritual connection, and that is another part that constitutes a nation from the spiritual point of view. We were a nation because Israel was the center of our existence.
So we survived for thousands of years without...
The definition, another strength of that definition is that a nation are people that are connected to a land, even if they don't sit there physically, the land is part of who they are, and no one can separate it.
No one can separate it, but of course, in the realm of the real world, then of course you cannot put up this argument in order to justify the rights of Israel, because imagine, for instance, if every Jew would put religious arguments for to defend Israel, the Muslims would do the same thing. And then you will get into some kind of a clash between what does the Bible say, what does the Quran say, what does the Hadith say, and it will be interminable. So we have to recognize that the importance of for the Jews, because they are a people. This is the difference, as you mentioned before. The Christians are not a people. The Muslims are not a people. They are a religion. That's right. And then they wanted to become a universal religion by just this idea of wanting to be a universal religion. You forsake the designation of a people, because it is open to all peoples. So I believe that. When we talk about politics, or when we talk about diplomacy, or when we talk about the peace process, or things like that, and particularly now with Netanyahu in the White House and so on, we have to put forward arguments that fly in the face of what all other politicians are doing in other regions of the world, and we should say, why are we selectively treated differently?
Right. Right. Okay, we're going to talk more about that and find out what can we do to make sure, first of all, that everyone has a good understanding of the legal right for Israel, and what can we do going forward. So hang on, we're going to be right back.
We're talking about a time in history when the modern world as we know it was recreated. It was recreated at San Remo when the Ottoman Empire collapsed after 400 years of rule. And not only Israel, what we call Israel or Palestine, was created, but there were other countries created now. Can you comment on that? Exactly what they did and what they agreed on, and it wasn't so altruistic, was it?
No, it wasn't. That's right. Prior to San Remo, there was a secret treaty between France and England, in which they decided we are going to divide the Muslim part of the Middle East between our zones of influence. At San Remo, they decided we are going to get away with all these secret deals and put everything in the open. And now Palestine will be assigned to the Jews under a British mandate, but at the same time, Syria will be assigned to the French as a French mandate.
And Syria was a country created then.
Absolutely.
There was no Syria.
There was no Syria before, and there was no Mesopotamia unless you go to the Babylonian times.
And there was no Iraq.
Yes, that's right.
What else was created?
Well, this in Mesopotamia turned out to be Iraq later, and Syria eventually, the Syria under the mandate split between Lebanon and Syria. It is under the French mandate in Syria. There was a split between Lebanon and Syria because the French wanted to protect the Christian population, which was mainly concentrated on the western side, Lebanon. So these countries, Iraq, present-day Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, and indirectly Jordan, which came to be by different means.
By treachery, by British treachery.
Well, by British treachery, and they
it should
accepted
belong
this.
to us. It should belong to Israel.
Well, not all of it, but maybe.
Parts of it.
All these countries, they owe their legitimacy exactly to the same legal mechanism as Israel.
And what's
nobody
interesting-
questions their existence.
And nobody questions.
Yeah.
That's the point. Nobody questions the legitimacy of Iraq. People think Syria was there forever. Lebanon.
What,
Only Israel, the legitimacy of Israel.
what about the West Bank now in East Jerusalem? People are saying, settlements, occupied it's occupied territories. You watch it on mainstream news channel.
Yeah.
It's like it's standard
This-
vocabulary now.
This is killing, and it has been going on for so long that I wonder how such a mantra, such a sham, because it is all made up, has survived the test of time. How was it not demolished long time ago? When you talk about settlements are illegal, first of all, if you look at the text of the mandate, on Article 6, I think, in the mandate, they said not only settlements are legal, but they should be encouraged all over the land. So settlements cannot be legal. Anybody who said occupied Palestinian territories and illegally occupied Palestinian territories, the first question that we should ask these people is, sir or madam, would you please tell us who was it occupied from? Who was the prior sovereign that Israel took this land from them?
They'll say,
And they would say there is no prior sovereign because this West Bank, when it was before 1967, it was illegally occupied by the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, and everybody should recognize that. So when you take a land that was illegally occupied by somebody else, and that land was precisely designated to you according to documents in international law, it just casts the question and say, what are we talking about when we say occupy? Is it not just putting the world upside down, as Melanie Phillips wrote in her last book in April? She wrote a book called The World Turned Upside Down, where there is no more truth and lie, there is no more justice and injustice, there is no more victim and victimizer, everything is in the same hotspot.
I guess because Israel accepted the partition plan recommendations, which did not include the West Bank.
True.
So, and then it captured the West Bank and East Jerusalem in a defensive war in '67. So would you use that as an argument too, or do you say that you don't need to?
Well, first of all, this resolution, Resolution 81, that was passed in November 1947, the so-called partition resolution, this Resolution 81 was a resolution by the General Assembly, and it is not binding. It is only a recommendation, and it states at the very beginning of the text, recommends, the United Nations recommends.
Right, this is a partition plan.
Partition plan. That means that if the parties do not accept that recommendation, the whole text goes out
And
the
the
window.
Arabs did not accept the
Exactly.
recommendation.
That's
Instead,
it.
they declared war.
That's right. The second thing is that the United Nations, when they passed this resolution in 1948, that was in their third year of existence because it was created in 1945, and they haven't respected their own charter, because in the Charter of the United Nations there is an Article 80 which says nothing in this charter should come into conflict with previous rights that have been acquired by peoples or states. And these rights that have been acquired by the Jewish people on that particular land is something that the United Nations has no right to jettison. And the United Nations, unfortunately, forgot about Article 80 of their own charter and passed a resolution that is blatantly illegal.
It's illegal.
Because it doesn't fit with the previous agreements.
Right.
And the third thing, of course, is that if I were Ben Gurion in 1947, I wouldn't have a choice. I would say, by all means, we will take any land. Because after the Holocaust, there were hundreds of thousands of people in displaced camps all over the place, and you had to put these people
so
somewhere.
he wasn't about to bring international law into it.
Exactly. So that was almost if you had your knife.
We're going to
on
take
the
a
throat.
short break, and then, Salomon, I want to ask you why the UN says that the Jewish presence in East Jerusalem or West Bank is illegal, according to UN law. Hang in there. We're going to take a short break. We'll be right back. Okay, we're back here on MENSCHlife with Salomon Benzimra and Channa Sargon, and we're talking about Israel. We're talking about the Jewish right to Israel from a legal, historical, religious perspective. So my question, Salomon, to you was, why does the UN have these resolutions that says that the Jewish presence in West Bank and East Jerusalem is illegal?
Well, this concept of illegal occupation is a legal concept, and when it started, it's because they decided that the Israeli government never annexed the West Bank. By not annexing it, they would consider that it is under belligerent occupation. That means that there is an army there, and we are just waiting until we negotiate peace, and then we will solve it in one way or the other, and that is exactly the terms of Resolution 242 of the Security Council that say we have to have Israel with secure and recognized borders, and then they will withdraw to territories. We will withdraw from territories, not all the territories, but we will withdraw from territories in order that we have secure and recognized borders and the end of the state of belligerency. Now, this didn't happen yet. So, even if anybody considers that it is under occupation, it is not illegal, because the Resolution 242 of the Security Council says we have to negotiate before we decide on the borders. Second, how can it be illegal? How can you occupy your own land that belongs to you by right? If Israel is not there by right, obviously it is an occupier. And if you are an occupier, you follow the fate of all these occupying powers in the 50s, France, England, Belgium, and others, who left all the colonies in Africa and elsewhere, because colonization is over. And so, the thing to understand is that this land is not colonized. It is not occupied. It is part of the territory of the mandated
And that's what
territory.
Should Israel have annexed the West Bank?
That is for Israel to decide, because when you annex a territory, then you have to deal with what you do with the population. Are you
But
going
why annex? Why go through the legal maneuvers of annexing? It's there. It belongs, and that's it.
That's right. But the thing that is, in 1967, in my view, the Israeli government made a big mistake, because they just decided themselves in 1967. The lawyers that advised the Prime Minister were saying we should not annex the West Bank, we should keep it under belligerent occupation, because probably they were afraid of having 1 million people, or several hundred thousand at that time, becoming Israelis. Yeah? And so the thing was a little bit in flux at that time. But you see, a people is never occupied. What is occupied is the land. We should first of all separate the two issues and say, let us first of all deal with the land. Whose land is it first? Let us talk about the title to the land. Once the whole world agrees with the title to the land and recognizes all these provisions of international law that have been just violated, at that time we can say, okay, now that we recognize that the land, the title to the land belongs to the Jewish people, let us solve the human problem, the people's problem, in the best way possible for the better.
Earlier in the show, Channa was talking about how the Jewish people are connected to the land of Israel, whether we, physically, materially have Israel or not. So my question is, to Channa, is how important is Israel? Like, is it that how hard should we fight for it? But we're going to give you a second to think about it. We're going to take a short break, and we're going to be right back. Okay, we are back here on MENSCHlife with Channa Sargon and Salomon Benzimra. So my question was to Channa, if the Jewish people went so long without materially having Israel, can we survive without it? How hard should we be fighting now to retain our connection materially to Israel?
You know, I want to clear up first, the fact that we were outside of Israel didn't mean that we were not having Israel inside of us. We as a people cannot exist without this land. This land is the place where our values, the way we treat the stranger, the way we give charity, the things that are important to us, are connected to what the land has to do for us. The two parts of the physical and spiritual have to be in harmony, and a Jew can never survive without this land. The land is part of the essence, the soul, the heart of the Jewish people. The land gives us the opportunity to define our destiny, the character of our people, the values that we share. It comes from the land. When you open up the narrative, you are told right away, the first thing when you come into the land, you plant a tree. The tree represents life. Our Torah is a tree. A human being is a tree. The physical planting and what it represents and the way that we treat the poor around us, it's all connected to the land. A Jew without the land is like someone without his heart, without his essence, without his ability to actualize himself and to define himself as a nation and as a people. I think that what is not understood is that we cannot survive or maybe actualize ourselves and become a nation, as my friend said, without the land. All of our prayers are to the land. All our prophecy is in the land. All of our values are connected to the land. It is a part of what we as Jews give to the world, is the connection between the physical and the spiritual. You can have a nation, but how does this nation walk? How does this nation live? Depends on the land. That's why we cannot be separated. And anybody who tries to separate us and says to us, we are not against Jews, we are against Israel. Israel politics is, in my definition, an anti-Semite, because you don't separate the people and the land.
We had, last week, we were talking with the Ayan Vered from Israeli Antiquities Authority. He was talking about this fringe Jewish
Neturei
Orthodox
Karta.
group, Neturei Karta, who says that the Jewish people are in the land of Israel prematurely because the Mashiach hasn't come yet, if I understand what their doctrine is.
Yeah.
What do you say to that?
I have to tell you that I upset a lot of people about the Messianic time. You know, in the biblical narrative there is a beautiful commentary when Judah, the powerful son of Jacob, stood among the people who had no values for women, and he said, Tamar is more righteous than me. Some very fine commentators say the Messiah was born. So to me, a Messianic era is when people take responsibility for their action, if you know the story of Tamar. And I think the Messianic time for us is the time when we can live our life, accept our responsibilities, and be the people that we need to be. So this small segment are reading the text in a way that I can't even begin to understand.
Is it a literal interpretation?
You know, yeah. And not only it's literal, because the Bible doesn't have messianic, it has messianic ideas, but we don't really have a direct reading of the Messiah. But it's a really, not only literary, it is living out the essence in my thinking. You know, I don't want to be in a place of judgment, but in my thinking. And I think it's really interesting what we are sharing today, a lot of great information.
Just one step further. Christianity is based on Judaism. Muslim for sure is based on Judaism.
True.
All of which recognize the right of the Jewish people to a homeland, to that particular part.
You know what it's...
Yeah,
So it's illegitimate of Muslims
absolutely.
to want that part of the land, to Muslimize it. That's what's ironic.
Yeah. And it is even stated in the Quran. There is a surah in which they say that the land of Israel belongs to the people of Moses, the Moses people. And this is the argument that the Sheikh from Rome, Imam Palazzi, is trying to put together, to present it to all the Muslims, saying, listen, look at your own holy book. The Quran is saying that this land belongs to the Jews. What are you talking about? And of course, unfortunately, the voices of radical Islam drowns
everything.
the voices of these people like Palazzi, and we don't hear of it.
So okay, so
You know,
so there are moderate voices
Yeah, definitely.
in his land.
Absolutely.
So is there any hope? I mean, Israel's made peace with Egypt. Israel's made peace with Jordan. Is there any hope that we can make peace and have a two-state solution with the Palestinians?
Definitely. The thing is that when we talk about the two-state solution, we are every few years it started with the two-state solution. Now we can count three-state solution, because the West Bank and Gaza are two different governments. You may talk about four-state solution, because Jordan may very well be considered as a Palestinian state, since 70% of its population is Palestinian. You know, and these people will just move from one side to the river, or of the river to the other. So, how many states can we carve out of a little sliver of land? You
That's
know?
less than the province of Ontario. It's ironic.
Yeah, Israel is the size of Lake Ontario. It's the
Lake
size of a
Ontario.
lake.
The size of
It's the
Lake
size of
Ontario.
Lake Ontario, no more.
Hannah,
But you know, in
does
the spirit,
yeah.
it is like
It's like
universe.
Hannah, is there anything that we can take from the Bible, from the Torah, that would help us to understand
I think that
in terms of our enemies?
yeah.
Because we see Israel so tiny. All we want is to have this little
This is
tiny
sliver thing.
stay in this huge sea of Arab lands.
Yeah.
Is there something that we could do? Does it say that our enemies will want to get rid of us? Do we understand that from the
I'm
from
a
the
little
Bible?
naive because I'm an educator, so I believe in education. So what I would like to say is that what we need to take out is first educate ourselves really well that we are the people of the book and the land. We are the people of the tent and the field. We have to educate ourselves and understand, all of us, how important this homeland is for us. We can survive without it.
And
then
what our
the
rights
world
are.
and the world has to understand through us
What our
what
rights
it
are.
is, because I don't think that the world understands the connection between the land and the Jewish people. I think the world is looking at the world, politically and rationally, but there is a lot of spirituality there, and I want to live in an upbeat
Right.
note. We've been here for so long, all nations disappeared, and it is because of this unique combination between a people and a land and becoming a people. So my message is, if we educate our people and we bring to the world a better understanding of who we are, not to look at us so narrow. We are a people with a tradition of 5,000 years of people and a land.
Well, we also have a special role in the world, do we
Yes,
not?
the
It's
light
not just
upon
to
the
show
nations.
everyone
That's
what our
right.
connection
the light
is.
upon the nations, but it begins in Jacob's dream. He saw the ladder grounded up to heaven. The first Zionist was born. In order to reach heaven, you need the ground. We need the ground to reach heaven. And Jews have to find a way to talk to the world, to tell them this is who we are. You can't take away our essence. And you are an anti-Semite when you start separating us, because we cannot be separated.
Salomon, final thoughts?
I think that in that light, we have allies. We are not alone. Far from it. We have allies, particularly among a big sector of the Christian population who recognize exactly our attachment to the Bible, because they read the same Bible in the same spirit. Whether they have eschatological views for the end of times which are different than ours, it doesn't matter. They are the best allies of Israel at this point, and we salute them. And we should work with them. The Christian Zionists, whether they are in the United States, in Canada, or in Europe, and it is particularly with these Christian Zionists in Europe that we associated ourselves to celebrate the 90th anniversary of San Remo last
Just
April.
recently, just
Yeah.
April.
Yeah, and I think we need to remember as Jews too what our role is, as Hannah said, which is tikkun olam, and to keep doing the great things, the productivity that Israel brings to the world, whether it's in the field of health or technology and the
Humanity?
aid and humanity and the aid in Haiti.
I've got
And
one
anywhere else?
final
Yes,
thought,
Doris.
and this may be rhetorical. The efforts to argue our case are ridiculous, because we are arguing our case based on their assumptions about us. occupation,
Okay.
rights of so-called Palestinians, of which they are not a nation technically as the legal definition. A total ignoring of international law by the powers that are, that were, and are, and will be. There's no changing that.
That's it.
So a lot, it's almost like Alice in Wonderland. It's a little, it's psychotic.
It is. Yeah.
And we are taking our clue from them instead of initiating, hey, this is not a big fat favor. We are entitled. This is our right, historically, religiously, legally, by every law made to man. Do you have any
Okay,
suggestions?
we're out of
Are
time.
we out of time?
We're out of time. Doris.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
If you have any suggestions, come
that's a
back.
very
That's a very
interesting
good one.
topic.
Yeah.
So we would love to have you both back, and that's a great lead-in for another show. So thank you both so much for being with us again today.
you.
Channa Sargon and Salomon Benzimra. Of course, my co-host Doris. I'm David Grossman.
Doris, and shalom till next week.
Shalom. Thanks again. Have a great week.